What are the comic books that CGC has graded the most from before 1935, the platinum era of comic books? We're starting a new series here. Let's take a look at those books up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hello panelologists, this is Jim from Bronzeville Comics. Welcome to the channel, and in this video we're going to be talking about CGC census data. I'm going to start a new series in which I'm going to work my way up through the years and look at the books that have been most submitted to CGC. Not the ones that are necessarily worth the most, but the ones for each year that have been submitted the most. We're going to look at the top 10, and then we're also going to look at some big keys, expensive books that are further down the list and get a comparison of the CGC census data. Now, we're going to start in the platinum era of comics, and next week we'll still be in the platinum era. We're going to move all the way up year by year to see how this list progresses. Now, I'm going to start, rather than a single year, I'm going to do everything up until and including 1934, because we have some magazines in here, but since they are comic book related, we're going to include them. We're going to mention some other things that CGC grades that populate their census, and that's going to be true especially here in the platinum era when there aren't a lot of comic books out there. And then, obviously once we get well into the 1940s, there are going to be plenty of comic books. So these books are going to be rare, hard to find items. We're going to count down to top 10, but I'm going to start with an honorable mention. And the honorable mention is Funnies on Parade, no number, from 1933, and this is the first comic book. And at this point in time, comic books were just compilations of newspaper comic strips, and they'd put together some of the more famous characters of the time, such as Mutt and Jeff and Joe Palooka, and some others that have been forgotten to time. There's no publisher listed for this book. It was a giveaway, and that's not uncommon for this period in time. There was a way to send for these comic books, and we're going Violet and Stevie, I guess. Again, I'm not really familiar with a lot of these characters. They did not survive in popular culture much past this, but there are just 14 copies of this book on the census, and it falls just shy of making the top 10 list, but it's worth mentioning because it's the first ever comic book. Let's go to number 10 on the list, and this is going to be a book that, a character that everybody's familiar with, and this is Mickey Mouse Magazine number 1 from 1933. It's a Walt Disney production, and there are often several versions of these, because this was done, I think, as a promotion for several dairy companies. And you see the cover here. We got Mickey and Minnie and a doll. I don't think that doll was a character in Mickey Mouse. Mickey Mouse had been in shorts at this point for 6 years, starting with Steamboat Willie, and was one of the more popular fictional characters in America at this time through the cartoon shorts that were seen in the movies. There are just 15 copies of this on the census, and back in August, an 8.5 sold for $2,740, which seems to be a fairly small amount for an important piece of Disneyana. Let's go to, there's a tie for number 8 on the list, and one of those books is Famous Funnies number 4. There are 16 copies of this on the census. This is from November of 1934, And these early Famous Funnies were 100-pagers. I don't know for sure. It's hard to tell if they were stapled or square bound. It almost looks like there's a staple in the upper left-hand corner of this book. You have Joe Palooka there on the cover. And I am not familiar with who the other characters are that we're seeing in this book. But this is a book that a 4.5 last year sold for a total of just $930. So just under $1,000 for a book that is, what now, 90 years old. And this is tied for 8th on the list with another book, which also has 16 copies on the census, and that's Century of Comics. No number, from 1933, and this is the third ever comic book. And it's interesting, a lot of these, this was published by Eastern Color. And again, distributed as a premium giveaway, a lot of the same characters, these, hodgepodge of characters on the front cover with a white background. That seems to be something that was fairly common at the time. And also that they had wraparound covers. I'm going to guess, since this was a giveaway, that there probably weren't ads in here. And, you're seeing that on the back page. So, again, these were not, at this point in time, comic books weren't available on newsstands in 1933. These were pretty much giveaways. So let's go to number 7 on the list. And this is Famous Funnies number 2 from 1934. It's from September 34. There's also a December 34 edition. And here they are nice enough to give us the name of some of the characters here on the left-hand side. Hairbreadth Harry, Joe Palooka, who survived well into the 1950s, had a couple of runs of his own comic book with different publishers. Mutt and Jeff, the same thing. They were syndicated comic strips. They did have a book that DC published in the 1940s. And I don't know how that name is pronounced, but there he is on the cover. Famous Funnies number 2. Again, there are 19 copies of this. Back in March, a 4.5 sold for $4,080. Number 6. And here we found a pedigree. Famous Funnies number 3. There are 20 copies of this on the census. And this particular 3.5 with slightly brittle pages was part of a Lost Valley pedigree that sold in May for at a 3.5 for $1,680. This is a first comic book appearance of Buck Rogers. And he's not featured on the cover. But we do know that Buck Rogers is a character that is still around. He had, a radio show. He had some movie serials with Buster Crabbe at the time. He had a movie, had a TV show in the 1970s. So it's a character that has been part of the American popular culture consciousness for nearly a century. Same number of copies. 20 copies on the CGC census is The Adventures of Mickey Mouse. This is from 1931, and it looks as though I'm not sure if that's a slab case. I think that's a slab case that we see in the picture there. It's a smaller book. This is the first ever Disney book, and there are different versions that exist. I guess there are several publishings, but it's a fairly rare book. Back in 2019, a 7.5 sold for $1,970. Again, not a lot of publicly traded sales of this. There are only 20 copies in existence. Let's go to number 4 on the list. And again, we're sticking with Famous Funnies. This is Famous Funnies number 5 from December of 1934. It's the first Christmas cover of a comic book. And there are 24 copies of this on the census. I think that's Hairbreadth Harry right there behind Santa. And I don't know who else. But we can see at this point in time, this is 10 cents. So this was sold on newsstands. And we will talk about that in a minute. But I think, this is the kind of item that does tend to see sales in December as people get excited for the holidays. And it does have a really cool piece of American pop culture history, and that it is the first ever Christmas cover of a comic book. Now, I'm going to make a pit stop before we go to number 3, because this is a book that's kind of in between 3 and 4. Oh, by the way, we see in the famous Funnies, and these all had wraparound covers. That's Joe Palooka, who thinks his leg is broken, but I'm not sure whose leg he's picking up there. It's not his. Anyway, we're going to make a pit stop before we go to number 3 on the list, and that's because we're going to talk about a pulp. Now, CGC has only recently started grading pulps, and this particular pulp has 27 copies on the Census, and it is a big book. It's Amazing Stories number 29, also known as Volume 3, number 5. This is from August of 1928, and right on the cover there, this is the first appearance of Buck Rogers. So this is, look at it, just an awesome, awesome cover. Probably some inspiration for Dave Stevens and the Rocketeer. I don't know if he ever saw this cover, but, it is... And this is a 9.8 for a pulp. And this particular copy sold in September for $105,000. Now, I tend to think there will be more pulps, coming out, because there are already 27 on the Census, and it's been just a handful of months since CGC has started grading them. There's already a 9.8, which is kind of remarkable. I'd be kind of interested to see what that looks like. This is something that is 96 years old, and still in a 9.8. That is pretty impressive. Let's go back to comic books. So pulps are not comic books, so we're not going to include them proper on the list. Magazines that include comic book stories, those are comic books. Those we count. But let's go to number 3 on the list, and this is Famous Funnies number 1. And this is the first monthly newsstand comic. It came out in July of 1934, and there are 28 copies on the Census. Back in December of last year, 5.0 sold for $25,000. And we can see at the bottom here that they do list the features that are contained within. It's 100 pages of comics, games, puzzles, and magic. So there were other things other than just the comic stories. And again, these were all reprinted from newspaper strips. Toonerville Folks, Mutt and Jeff, Hairbreadth Harry, that's the magician there on the front cover. Smatterpop, Nipper, Dixie Duggan, the Bungle Family, Connie, Ben Webster, Tailspin Tommy, Pam, the Nebs, Highlights of History, A Maze a Minute, and Screen Oddities. And then again, it was a wraparound cover. I'm not sure which of our featured characters are depicted here on the back cover. But this is, again, an enormous part of comic book history. First monthly comic book. And this book, I'm not sure how many issues did Famous Funnies last. I think it lasted into the 1950s, if I'm not mistaken. I'm going to take a quick look. I didn't make note of that. But there have been so many Famous Funnies on the list. And essentially, it was the only monthly comic book that was coming out at the time. As we get into the lists in the later 1930s, we will see other books populating there. Yeah, Famous Funnies ran until 1955 for a total of 218 issues. And that would be a really weird thing to collect, but kind of a fun thing to collect. I've come across, Famous Funnies all the time digging through Golden Age boxes. The ones that are the most expensive are the ones in the early 200s. There are series of them. They kind of got away from the the funnies, the kind of goofy characters, to more of a sci-fi bent towards the end of the run. And if you ever find them, the ones that are really desirable by comic book collectors, they did start to have some war books, but Buck Rogers did make his, he was in this in the 1950s. The ones to get are numbers 209 through 216, I think, that are all Frank Frazetta covers. And some of them are really highlights of the Golden Age and are worth a good deal of money. We're more in the thousands than in the hundreds of those values. But for number one, from 1934, a piece of comic book history. Let's take a look at number two. Now, we're jumping from 28 all the way up to 46 copies on the census of this book. And it is a copy of Buck Rogers, no number, from Kellogg Company in 1933, the cereal company that was founded in Michigan by, I think of Clark Kellogg, but Clark Kellogg was a college basketball announcer. Anyway, the Kellogg's, and if we take a look here, this is kind of fun. I really like this cover. Dick Calkins art. It is a smaller book. It contains it's the first Buck Rogers radio premium. So you got this from listening to the show on the radio back at the height of the Depression in 1933. And if we look at the back cover, these tins almost look like what you would get when I was a kid, get Band-Aids in, of Kellogg's Bran Flakes, Corn Flakes, All Bran, or Pep Bran Flakes, Rice Krispies, and whole wheat biscuit. There were no, and there's also their coffee. There's no mascots here, no cartoon characters, no Tony the Tigers or Toucan Sam's, but there's a letter included here, and it's from Kellogg's in Battle Creek, Michigan. And it says, "Dear listener, we are pleased to enclose your copy of the new Buck Rogers booklet." And you can see there the envelope that it came in was saved by the collector and, preserved with the slab. In case you have missed the earlier episodes on the radio, it brings you up to date and tells you how it began. While we sincerely regret the delay, which was occasioned by some of the last-minute changes, we believe that the book has been greatly improved as a result. May we also hope that you are enjoying Kellogg's cereals in your home. It is through your response and interest that we are able to bring you these radio entertainments. And just as the Buck Rogers program is one of the most advanced and modern programs on the radio, Kellogg's cereals are among the finest and most modern of healthful foods. Please feel free to write us at any time. We wish to thank you again for your letter, both on behalf of the Kellogg Company and of Wilma, Dr. Hoyer, Buck Rogers, and others in the cast. And P.S., we have enough books on hand now that we will be pleased to send copies to your friends upon receipt of a Kellogg package top. And they had so many extra copies that 46 have survived to the present day and have gotten slabbed and graded by CGC. Now, which book has the most copies on the census from 1934 or earlier? Well, it is another issue of Famous Funnies, and it's Famous Funnies Carnival of Comics. This predates Famous Funnies number 1. This was also a premium giveaway, and it doesn't have a number, and this is the second comic book after Funnies on Parade, and kind of has that same cover motif. The character is just all over the cover with a white wraparound cover. There are 53 copies on the census, and I'm only talking about Universal Blue Label. There are another 17 restored. This does have a 9.2 on the census, and the most recent sale in any grade is November of 2023. A 7.0 sold for $4,320. So there you have it. Those are the top books that are on the CGC census from 1934 or earlier. We're not delving a lot into the characters that you know, and it'll be a few years before we get to Superman in Action Comics number 38. But this is kind of fun to see how the history of comics progressed from the early throughout the 1930s. And again, this famous Funnies, a Carnival of Comics, that is a compilation of newspaper comic strips over the years. So I hope you enjoyed this content. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and let me know if you have any of these books. If you do, I am impressed. Some of them are not unaffordable. It's not like, these are a lot more affordable than Action Comics number 1, and some of them for a lower grade copy you can probably get for a few $100s. So, yeah, thanks for taking a look at this particular video. You can take a look at a couple of my other videos here. And this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.